Hello, and welcome to the Jewish Heretics Podcast. This is the official podcast of the United Jewish People's Order and the Morris Winchevsky Center. We are a secular, progressive Canadian Jewish organization that's been around since the 1920s. My name is David Wall, and I'm the community's cultural programmer, and I'll be your host today. For this, the 11th episode of our podcast, I had the honor of speaking to internationally celebrated artist, writer, journalist, and historian Molly Crabapple. Molly got her start as the house artist for New York's most notorious nightclub. She became a journalist sketching the front lines of Occupy Wall Street before covering, with words and art, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Lebanese snipers, Guantanamo Bay, the U.S.-Mexican border, Pennsylvania prisoners, New York cabbies, Greek refugee camps, and the ravages of Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. She once confronted Donald Trump in Dubai about the fact that his workers there got paid $100 a month. As an award-winning animator, she has pioneered a new genre of live illustrated journalism, collaborating with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Jay-Z, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the ACLU. Her animations are on permanent display at the Equal Justice Initiative's Legacy Museum in Montgomery, Alabama. Molly has spoken to audiences around the world, from Jakarta to Beirut, Sao Paulo to Ramallah, Mumbai to Paris, at universities including Harvard, Yale, Columbia, and the London School of Economics, and at museums including the Brooklyn Museum and the Guggenheim. Her art is in the permanent collections of the Museum of Modern Art, the United States Library of Congress, Columbia University, and the New York Historical Society. Most recently, Molly was awarded the Dorothy and Louis B. Cullman Fellowship through the New York Public Library to work on a history of the Jewish Labour Bund. Our conversation was wide-ranging, from Toulouse-Lautrec to Palestine, from playing chess to learning Yiddish. Here's our conversation. Molly Crabapple, thanks so much for taking the time out to be on our podcast. How are you today?
I'm good. I just beat my boyfriend at chess, which I do most mornings, except the mornings that he beats me at chess. And I've had my third cup of espresso, so I'm doing good. How are you?
Oh, chess. We could go on about chess. It's a major part of, actually quite traumatic part of my childhood around my father. So you've just opened. I have to end the interview.
Did your dad beat you at chess relentlessly and never once let you win?
Well, it wasn't that. It was that when I was a boy, I wanted to be my dad. I worshipped him, and I would cry if I lost. So then he would begrudgingly and quite obviously let me win. And we both knew he was letting me win. Anyway, it's very complicated.
Yes.
So if there's any conceit to this podcast, we're pretty loose, but if there's any conceit, it's that we're trying to find different ways of expressing progressive Jewishness in the 21st century. And you are perfect for this, obviously. And so I like to ask guests, where did you get your Jewish superpowers?
I do have superpowers.
So for example, you were born in Queens. Yeah.
I was. Morocco,
And
yeah.
so I want you to tell me about your parents, how you were raised, especially in terms of your Jewish upbringing, if you had any. Did you have any religion in your upbringing, anything like that?
So I'm mixed. My dad is Puerto Rican and my mom is Jewish. My mother is an amazing artist. She draws maybe like how I would draw if I was a nicer, better person. She's a fucking fantastic artist. And she's comes from a family that's like very culturally Jewish. And I don't just mean that in the sense of bagels. I mean that in the sense of socialism. Mm. Her great-grandfather, who was also an artist and who taught her how to paint, was a member of the Jewish Labour Bund. And he did hundreds of watercolors, many of which showed moments of his Bundist memories back in Tsarist Russia. So that was something that was like always in my family upbringing. Mm. My mom, typical, right? Like she would celebrate Hanukkah with me, even though we didn't really know the prayers and we would kind of like mutter, once you got past the Baruch Atah part. But we never really celebrated other holidays. My dad is He's Puerto Rican, Marxist, independentista. He dislikes Catholicism in the way that only someone who has been beaten by a nun at a Catholic school can dislike Catholicism. So I did not grow up with Christianity as part of my life at all. Um, in terms of religiousness, when I was 8, for some reason, my mother made me go to this terrible conservative Jewish school for 1 year, which I loathed. I truly loathed it with all of my heart. The thing I remember most was we little brats had to sit through these endless synagogue services in Hebrew. And there was this rumor that spread amongst the brats like myself that if the rabbi dropped the Torah, he couldn't eat for a month. And so we would sit there being like, drop the Torah, drop the Torah, drop the Torah. Just have something that would break the misery of this fucking experience. But blessedly, that only lasted a year, and then I went
Mhm.
back to public school. And for me, being Jewish was like reading I.B. Singer or, um, reading about like Jewish socialists or the Rosenbergs. And I never related at all to like institutional Jewishness. I think also because my mom's from a very, very working class family. And so we, like a lot of synagogues charge money, you know what I mean? So I never really had that like very, conventional thing. And then when I was 17, I went to Morocco and I fell in love with the Arabic language. And I learned to read Arabic. I read like contemporary Arabic literature. I ended up traveling all over the Middle East. And so I never had the what would I say, like the Zionist part of your upbringing where you like do birthright or whatever. That
Mhm.
was never a part of my childhood or my growing up.
Interesting. You just made me think. So when you spent a year in Hebrew school or whatever it was, um,
Yeah.
makes me think about this because I had a well, lots of differences, but also a similar upbringing in terms of the secularism, in terms of the progressive politics and stuff. The Rosenbergs and that whole history played a big part in my childhood. Um, but I remember accompanying my friend who was being brought up as a conservative Jew, capital C conservative Jew, to his Hebrew school a few times because I was envious. I said, "Can I come along?" And there was lots of Holocaust education. How was that? How was the Holocaust introduced to you when you were a kid by your mom, say, and what was your relationship to that history growing up?
My Jewish family came from Belarus in the like at the turn of the century.
Hmm.
My grandfather came in 1904, and every single member of my great grandfather and my great grandmother's family that stayed in Belarus was murdered, as far as I know. Perhaps someone wasn't, but both by their own memories and also by my own digging, every single one of their family members was murdered. And I grew up, obviously, like all Jewish kids, grow up very, very aware of the Holocaust, of being a real presence. And then when I went to this conservative school, they do something which I'm just going to call re-traumatization, which is literally having you at a pre-rational age. You're, 7, 8 years old, endlessly watching like highly, highly explicit films about how little kids like you were gassed to death, right? Little kids like you had their heads shaved, little kids like you saw their baby sisters thrown in the air and used at target practice. And the message of that is very much you cannot trust the Goyim. The
Mm.
Goyim are just waiting for any moment to go and genocide you. They're literally hiding behind a tree waiting to genocide you. So that's why you need Israel. Um, that was very, very, very much the aim of that sort of education at
Hmm.
the Orthodox school that I went to. And it's incredibly effective, right? Because you're 8 years old and suddenly you're having nightmares about how the Nazis are going to murder your mom. And it gets into you in this way that it takes many, many years of looking at seriously to realize that the world is not divided into Jews and Goyim, and the Goyim are not all going to murder you.
Mm.
Um, but the other part of Holocaust memory, I would say, was when I was, in high school, I got really into reading Hannah Arendt, and I got really into reading about like the resistance. So there's also the anti-fascist memory, I would say.
Yeah, we'll get into that with some of the work you're doing around the Bund. Um, so I think you've sort of answered this, but I'm going to ask anyway because maybe there's some more detail. Uh, I want to talk about your discovery, your entry into progressive politics, which is so much of your identity. Uh, so I like to tell the anecdote about my mom, who at the age of 13 became radicalized by the Rosenberg trials. She witnessed it and she became radicalized and never looked back. So she's a person who had this moment of radicalization. Or did you come to it more gradually? What was your experience of entering into a world of I'll say maybe Jewish informed progressive politics?
So my father is a Marxist. Like my father is a political economist by training. He was one of the young people who helped force colleges to teach Puerto Rican studies as a discipline,
Mm.
by doing sit-ins at CUNY. My father was someone who, when I was 12, got me Huey Newton's memoirs, and Emma Goldman's memoirs as well. Speaking of, radical Jewishness, and I just grew up in a house where
Well, it was like, happy birthday, here's Huey Newton's memoirs.
yeah, here's revolutionary suicide. Yeah. No, I literally grew up in a house. I remember the first time I saw black skin, white masks, I was like 6. Like it was just on the shelf
Okay.
and I just the cover. So that's just how I grew up. One of the things I always tell about my father is when he was explaining Marxist economics to me, he picks up a glass and he's like, "What makes this glass have value?" And I'm like,
Mm.
"I don't know, glass is made of sand, right? Does sand have value?" And he's like, "Bullshit. It's not that sand has value. What gives this value is that a human went and they dug that sand out of the earth, and then other humans with their skill and with their time, they melted the sand down and put it into shapes that other humans had designed, and then they packed it, and other humans and drove it to stores, and then other humans sold it. And so what actually gives this value is human life and human skill and time. However, in order for the boss to make a profit, he can never pay those workers as much value as they've generated. And so capitalism is built on stolen human life."
Mhm. Mhm. It's interesting though that there are different ways to react to this as a kid. I like
Mhm.
to, you're younger than I, obviously, but there was this stupid show called Family Ties that had, what's his name? Anyway, the Alex Keaton was the character. And so the parents are hippies and he turns into this right-wing Republican teenager.
Yeah.
So the Alex Keaton effect is that you react against and rebel.
I think my rebellion was I didn't graduate college, right? I had a
Oh,
very
I see.
yeah, I had a very askance, and I still have a very askance view of academia. I think that was my rebellion, even though I've since, gained a lot more respect for a lot of academics too. But I was a real brat about that when I was a
Right.
kid.
Right. Well, there you go. I'd like to switch into just talking about your art for a moment. Uh, your development as an artist. You have a really distinct style that makes, if I see something about Molly Crabapple online or wherever, it's obviously by Molly Crabapple, which is, I think, a real triumph and the sign of a great artist. One of the signs of a great artist that you have a recognizable style. Congratulations. Um, and now I found in interviews and sources online artists that you mentioned, like Toulouse-Lautrec and Diego Rivera, Goya, and others. What is it about those artists that have inspired you? And do you see politics as being necessary or inextricably linked to making art? Is it separable? There
Um,
you go. That's quite a question.
yes, it's a two-part question.
Yes.
Answer the first. No, I don't think politics is inseparable from making art, except insofar as politics controls and dictates so many aspects of your life.
Mm.
So, for instance, if I was born in Renaissance Florence, and there's a political system that was set up based around Medici patronage, and my other option was to go make portraits for the church, that would obviously dictate, right, a lot of my art. There's a reason that Michelangelo just didn't do like muscle boys, that he had to call them Adam and Moses, and that had everything to do with politics.
Mm.
Um, but I don't think that an artist is under an obligation to do protest posters. I think that I have done so much political work because I am political and because art is my trade. If I was a cook, I'd probably be cooking for the free kitchen. If I was a carpenter, I'd probably be building things.
Hmm.
I'm an artist, so that's what I do. But no, I do not, absolutely do not think that artists are under the moral obligation to make all their work political. I think the only obligation that we're under in regards to politics is the obligation human beings are under, citizens are under, to try to make the world a bit more better and more just. But I don't think that's something that is exclusive to artists. Now, in terms of like why I like the artists I like, I think I've always been attracted to artists that document extremes of the human condition. Like, I know that Vermeer is a really good artist. I know that. I can recognize he painted that pearl earring or whatever really good. I'm so fucking bored when I look at his work. I'm like, a bitch in a kitchen. Great. Brilliant. You did the light really good. Wow. Bow down. It's just not my thing, man. I'm not saying he's not great. But to lose the track, right? Where I'm like, man, you're drawing these syphilitic dancing girls kicking the hat off of the Prince of Wales. You're this dwarf hanging out in brothels, drawing all these chicks sleeping with each other. And then you're drawing like circus clowns, you're drawing rich, disgusting scumbags at nightclubs, you're drawing all of these human, extreme, sexy, depraved things, then that's something, right? That's something I fucking love. Same with Goya, right? That he can draw the disasters of war and then he can draw Maha Desnuda. The the sex, the war, the conflict, the death, the unstinting view of the human condition and the commitment to experience all of life. The ravenousness, I would say, is what I love in it.
What about aesthetically speaking, in terms of influence you've had? Because you have a particular look to your art. There's the fine lines, the use of color. Are there artists that, I know this is a trite question, are there artists that you would point people towards and say, this is a person that just in terms of the aesthetics, in terms of the look on the page, that has really influenced me or that I'm very excited by?
So an interesting thing is when I started, people used to think I was really influenced by R. Crumb. And I love R. Crumb's work, obviously, but when I was young, I actually didn't know his work I mean, I knew the name, but he was not someone I was like looking at. But the reason that my work looked kind of like R. Crumb then is that me and him were both influenced by the same lithographs and woodcuts.
Hmm.
And there's a way that an artist who's working with pen and ink draws if they're trying to mimic what a woodcut looks like, with all of
Interesting.
those super fine lines, all of that cross hatching. And I think both me and him were trying to do that. In fact, I read an interview by him, I believe, where he was talking about being very influenced by those woodcuts and trying to mimic them too. Um, I think that in terms of like what really influenced my style, I love Victorian illustrations. I love Nast. I love that moment when illustration was everywhere, when illustration capered over every single surface. And a lot of that was like black and white line illustration because that's what's easy to reproduce. Um, I also had a book my mom gave me, Arthur Guptill's Complete Rendering in Pen and Ink, which is one of these super, super, super rigorous, almost like fascistically mean books that tells you how to do pen and ink in like the 1920s, 1930s tradition. And I went through that. Like I learned how to draw from that. I did all of the like stippling and the cross hatching and stuff. And that had a huge, huge influence on me. I loved old burlesque posters. I loved, I don't know, anything that had like chicks in black stockings with their hair in a messy bun.
Yeah, okay. Let's leave that there. That is fascinating. I would love to talk to you for hours about the art, the history of art, and your place in it. But I want to switch over because we don't have all the time in the world. I want to switch over to Yiddish, your relationship to Yiddish. What was your gateway to it? Was it simply that you wanted to study the history of the Bund, and so I'd better learn Yiddish? I mean, I find that so amazing. I've talked to other people like you who are like, oh, I'd like to learn a language. I'm going to learn it now. Oh, now I know it. Like, I just find that so foreign and so impossible. I studied Yiddish for years. I came at it from the place of a singer to be able to sing in Yiddish. I studied to be a cantor. Um, but my Yiddish is terrible and always has been, and I just find it so difficult to learn languages. So kudos to you in that area, and also Arabic. You've let it out that you learned Arabic. Um, but do you see? And I think this is I've asked other people this. I think Yiddish is special to me. It's different, and it's hard for me to articulate what makes it different. So, for example, do you see Yiddish and studying Yiddish as something that where the language is particular to history and politics and say a language of oppression, and we need to approach it differently when we learn it? Or is it just kind of like learning French? Oh, I'm going to learn a language now.
So first of all, I just need to clarify some things about so I'm not accused of stolen valor with my languages. I also am bad at Yiddish. I can read Yiddish. I can do all of my research in Yiddish, and I read hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of Yiddish to do my book. But I cannot have a conversation with the Satmar people in my neighborhood to save my life.
Mm.
And every so often, like some really cool Yiddishist kid comes up to me and is trying to like strike up a conversation, and within 2 sentences I'm just staring like a slack-jawed fool. So please, like Yiddishists who actually like can speak it and write it and are like resurrecting that world, I don't want to steal your valor. I'm just someone who reads it, and I can do research in it, and I have an elderly Yiddish pen pal.
Okay,
But
so you can pretend that that's not incredibly impressive, but yeah, do go on.
so Yiddish. Yiddish, as Max Weinreich said, was well, the Max Weinreich quote is, "A dialect is a language without a navy,"
Mm.
meaning that Yiddish was, considered a minor language, if even a language at all. Usually, it was called jargon or dialect because it is a language that never had state power behind it. The closest that we have to an Alliance Française in Yiddish is YIVO.
Mm.
And it is different to study. I mean, first of all, just on a practical level, right? So I've studied, in my time, I've studied French, Spanish, and Arabic. And the only one I've managed to get pretty fluent in is Spanish. But, I studied these three languages, and these are imperial languages, right? Huge swaths of the world speak French, Spanish, and Arabic because of empire. Um, and so what does it mean, right, when something's an imperial language? It means that someone who is not like quote unquote ethnically of that language group, who is a brilliant poet or writer, will write in that language. For instance, with Arabic, Ahmed Shawki is considered one of the greatest poets of the Arabic language. He's Kurdish. Why didn't he write in Kurdish? Why did he write in Arabic? Because there's no resources behind Kurdish at the time. The same with someone like Gogol writing in Russian as opposed to Ukrainian, or Chekhov writing in Russian as opposed to Ukrainian, or Isaac Babel writing in Russian as opposed to Yiddish. An imperial language attracts all of the best talent. It also has all of the resources. There
Mm.
is a million dictionaries, linguistic formalizations, academies, university departments. Every possible resource is put into an imperial language. Whereas when something is a dialect that lacks state support, you have one online dictionary, Wörterbuch, it's called for Yiddish, where you have to pay every single time you look up a fucking word, right? One, you have a monopoly on it. That is what happens when you are a minor language, when you are not French or Spanish or Arabic or Russian or Chinese.
Well,
You end up Yeah, you end up having to pay to look up every fucking word because one dictionary has a monopoly on it, because that's the only group of people that ever made an online dictionary. It means that you have to download a special hacked keyboard to type in Yiddish on your computer. It also means that there's no standardization of the language. So I live in Satmar, Williamsburg right now, which is one of the only places in the world where Yiddish is a living language that kids
mm.
grow up with as their first language. And their Yiddish is so different than the Yivo Yiddish. And these people will fight to the death over who has the right Yiddish. But that's sort of even the question of who has the right Yiddish or not is what happens when you don't have a state, because we know who has the right French. France has the right French
Hmm.
because they have the fucking power to impose the idea that their French is the right French. Um, the other thing about Yiddish is that it always has like the whiff of tragedy, right? When you're reading it, there's no way, I think, to read and learn Yiddish without some heartbreak, because except for, like Satmar Williamsburg and nerds like us, it's not a living language. And the reason it's not a living language is it was systematically murdered. And then the last sparks of it that remained were crushed beneath Israeli hegemony and American assimilation. That's why it's not a living language anymore. So when you're reading it, it's always this act of like necromancy, of communing with the lost world. Even if you're trying to revive it, it's utterly not the same as trying, like if you were learning Italian opera, that would have a totally different uh set of emotional resonances than if you're learning Yiddish to, sing Goldfaden's operettas, right? It's not necromancy to learn Italian. It can be, maybe, if you're doing specific things, but just the act of learning Italian itself does not implicate you in this history of like repression and genocide and erasure the way that Yiddish does.
Hmm.
And I think that's why I got so addicted to it, because I felt like I was doing this act of resurrecting the dead.
Interesting. So, in some ways, engaging with Yiddish, speaking Yiddish, reading Yiddish is a. I would go further. Is it a political act, a rebellious act in itself to do that? A kind of thumb nose at history, thumb nose at Zionism? Is it kind of, is it instilled with political activism as well?
Mean, it doesn't have to be, right? Like, even though my neighborhood is an anti-Zionist neighborhood, the Satmars do not believe in the state of Israel. They reject it. But nonetheless, I would never call their usage of it rebellious.
No,
Um,
yours. I'm saying
yeah, it's
someone who
fine.
learns. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But it can be. I mean, so I learned Yiddish because I wrote a book about the Bund, and there is no way to possibly write about the Bund in any sort of depth without learning Yiddish, because these stubborn bastards kept all of their major materials in Yiddish until they folded in 2003. So I if you want to actually write about the Bund and you don't want to be completely reliant on other people's translations and historiography with all the biases that implies, you have to learn Yiddish, right? So you can read them firsthand. And so in that sense, it was political. And then just the idea of like communing directly with the past without having to go through current historians, without going through translators. Yes, of course it's political, right? Because you can hear what people said at the actual time without anyone filtering it. For instance, one of the things that I realized when I my Yiddish got good enough and when I started going into the archives is that the Bund was even more anti-Zionist than they're currently painted, and that they did engage with the Palestinian nationalist movement, not on like a person-to-person level, except for a few encounters, but as on an intellectual level, in terms of like, reading translations from the Arabic press, realizing there was a Palestinian national movement, and viewing them as, on an equal basis and as, as people.
Hmm.
And that was something that I never learned, that I never realized from a lot of English historiography on the Bund. It was something that I got from sitting and reading the archives of their newspapers in interwar Poland, or from going to YIVO and photographing an entire pamphlet called "What Can We Learn from the Events in Palestine," written in 1929 by Horner, the Bundist, and doing a rough translation for myself to see what they said. Um, and I think that's the capacity where Yiddish feels rebellious for me. It's to know our own past, to know our own past directly.
So you're referencing this project. Can you just speak about it? And what got you into? I mean, your great grandfather Sam Rothbard was, you know, a Bundist and a big part of your we've gleaned, a big part of your sensibility and your upbringing and all that. What compelled you to study the Bund and talk a little bit about your project?
Shit, man. So I finished writing a 430-page manuscript on the Jewish Labour Bund and my great-grandfather that's currently with my editor. May he, at Random House, may he edit it soon so that it can go to the press at some point.
How long did that take you?
5 years.
5 years.
Yeah, 5 years. 1 year of really concerted work. I got a fellowship at the New York Public Library, and they locked me in an office and gave me money so I didn't have to do other things. And that actually was the thing that took it over the finish line. But from the point that I got the proposal to the point that I turned in the manuscript was 5 years.
Wow.
Yeah, I know, right? Fool that I am. Why did I start writing about the Bund? I I wrote an article about them at first in 2018.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, why did I write about them? I think I was looking through my great-grandfather's watercolors again. And as I said, he did over 600 watercolors of his memories of this like godforsaken town he came from called Volkovisk in Belarus. And there was a watercolor that I was obsessed with when I was growing up. It shows this young woman. She's dressed in the fashion of the turn of the century. So she's wearing a corset. Her hair is up, kind of like a Gibson girl. She's wearing a long skirt. And she's with her boyfriend, and they're walking down some godforsaken shtetl street at night. And this woman is throwing a rock through a window. And her boyfriend is next to her, holding more rocks. So she doesn't have to carry her own rocks. And it was titled Itka the Bundist, Breaking Windows. And I got obsessed. I was like, what's a Bundist? What is this thing that, whatever this is, what is this category of young woman in a shtetl who's walking around at night with her boyfriend breaking windows? This is not what I thought. This is not some Fiddler on the Roof shit. This is something that I never suspected. I never suspected this existed. And so that was what originally got me interested in the Bund. And I found many more paintings of the Bund in his collection, you know, ones of young people raising the red flag in the woods, beating the shit out of strike breakers, burning down factories, uh, getting into street brawls. It was an armed movement. And I just started becoming obsessed. And then I learned they were anti-Zionist also. And I had been to Palestine at this point. I'd even been to Gaza before. And the idea that there was this party that was so Jewish in one of the most anti-Semitic places in the fucking earth, right? The Tsarist Empire, that was so proudly and defiantly Jewish, that was socialist, and that was also anti-Zionist, that like really intrigued me. And so when I wrote my article, to do that, I read every single English book on the Bund I could get my hands on. And I also paid for this Yiddish portion of this Yiddish book to be translated. That's called the Volkovisk Yitzkor Buch. Now, what's a Yitzkar book? Yitzkar books are oral histories of nearly every single godforsaken Eastern European place that were written after the Holocaust by survivors. And these oral histories are amazing because the only way I think I can compare it to is imagine a nuclear bomb fell on New York City and it killed everyone except for 8 people. And one of them is an Upper East Side socialist. One of them is a steroid monster Chud from Staten Island. One of them is like a Bangladeshi shopkeeper. One of them is a recently arrived Ecuadorian immigrant selling candy. And one of them is a .com guy. And you ask those people what was New York, and imagine what your vision would be of New York. That's what a Yitzkar book is like. It is human, incredibly biased, obviously, and biased in every which way, you know, of course, not just in one way, and detailed, gossipy, mean very often, settling scores. And there was a Yitzkar book about Volkovisk that I later learned that Sam contributed to, that had a chapter on the Bund. And so I paid for it to be that chapter to be translated. And it opened up a fucking world. I learned that Sam got involved with the Bund because he was a apprentice at a leather tannery, and they had this scam going where the bosses who were Jewish had to let the workers off for Shabbos, but as soon as the sun fell on Saturday night, you had to get back to the fucking tannery
On
and work
Saturday
all
night.
yeah, on Saturday night and work
Huh.
all night to make up for the fact that you didn't work during Shabbos. And so the Bund came into this town and they unionized the apprentices so that they didn't have to work Saturday nights. That was the first battle. And they did this by major street brawls that took place in front of the synagogue during Yom Kippur while Kol Nidra is being, sung by the cantor. And I was like, holy fuck, man. And I I just ended up learning this about my great grandfather, that he was involved in this movement that was militant, that was armed, that was obsessed with self-education. I mean, my great grandfather dropped out of school when he was like 12, I think, to work. And nonetheless, he was someone who read Shakespeare and knew about Rembrandt, and had a huge art history background, someone who corresponded with IB Singer. And I was like, how did he get this education? It was through the Bund and later through the Workmen's Circle. So I wrote this article about the Bund that was about their history, about how they changed from the early days in the Tsarist Empire to interwar Poland, to helping lead the Warsaw Ghetto revolts, to their long decline after the war. And when it was published, it was the most viral thing I've ever written in my life.
Hmm.
Nothing I've ever written, ever, has resonated like this piece on the Bund, for people of all backgrounds. But most sacred to me was a lot of elderly people from Bundist families got in touch with me. Like Viktor Galinsky, whose father, Shloime Galinsky, ran the Medem Sanatorium, which was a sanatorium in interwar Poland for tubercular slum kids. Or Zuckerman, this amazing guy who grew up in a Bundist home in the Bronx, who translated the memoirs of Bernard Goldstein, the head of the Warsaw Self-Defense Militia, or Irena Klepfich, whose father was the head bomb maker for the Warsaw Ghetto. I mean, these are amazing people, and they got in touch with me, and they were willing to share their memories with me. So when that happened, I was like, I can't just leave this as an article. I have to write a book on it. And pretty soon I realized, if I'm going to write a book on this, I have to learn Yiddish.
Yeah. I'm going to, that's an amazing, thank you for illuminating me in that way. Incredible story, incredible journey. I'm going to, so that article from New York Review that is just wonderful. I'm going to spew some of your own article back at you right now, and I'm going to do a quote. It's not novel length, but it's a bit of a sizable quote, and I want to get your reaction to it. In the article, you say, when the Bund is acknowledged at all today, it is often characterized as naive idealism whose concept of here-ness, Doigkeit, lost its argument to the Holocaust. But as I watch footage on social media of Israel snipers' bullets killing Palestinian protesters, I think that Bundism, with its Jewishness that was at once compassionate and hard as iron, was the movement that history proved right. So now you're making reference to 2018. I assume you're making, when you're talking about the snipers, it's the Gaza protests up against the wall that you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
What do you mean, say, in the context of the genocide going on right now in Gaza, that the Bund and anti-Zionism has been proven right?
So in return, I'm going to read a quote by Henrik Ehrlich, who is the head of the Bund in interwar Poland. And let me find this. You'll
Certainly.
forgive.
This is
Take me.
this is excellent. This is an excellent tit for tat. Anyway, I just absolutely love that quote, by the way. It's the most magnificent thing I've read in a long time. But yeah, go on.
The Ehrlich quote or my quote?
Your quote. I haven't heard the Ehrlich quote yet.
Okay, so Henrik Ehrlich wrote this quote in 1938. And he wrote this quote in response to criticism from his father-in-law, who was the eminent Jewish historian Shimon Dibnov, where Shimon Dibnov was yelling that the Bund was acting like a bunch of sectarian, stubborn idiots for not uniting with Zionists. At this point, when Jews in Poland were suffering the most insane anti-Semitic persecution. And Henrik Ehrlich is saying it's not that we don't fight for Jews, it's that we refuse to unite with Zionists because we fight for Jews. And he writes this long letter where he lists all of the ways that Zionists have collaborated with anti-Semites, including the fact that in the late 30s, at a point when the Polish government was literally paying fascist youth squads to bomb Jewish neighborhoods and had introduced segregation in universities. At this point, that they were also arming Zionist militias. So that's the type of collaboration he's talking about. He is saying, like, we can't unite with these people because look at them. They collaborate with anti-Semites. Their philosophy is based on despair. And ultimately, at their heart, they're racist. And he gives this quote, if a Jewish state should arise in Palestine, its spiritual climate will be eternal fear of the external enemy, Arabs, eternal struggle for every bit of ground with the internal enemy, Arabs, and an untiring struggle for the extermination of the language and culture of the non-Hebraized Jews of Palestine. Is this a climate in which freedom, democracy, and progress can grow? Indeed, is it not the climate in which reaction and chauvinism ordinarily flourish?
And
I don't think
when is this quote from? What year?
1938.
Hmm.
I don't think anyone on earth can look at that quote and not say that he was totally right. He
Hmm.
was 100% right. And Bundists saw that Zionism would be built on ethnic cleansing, and that this ethnic cleansing that they carried out to create a Jewish majority state would be the germ of a cancer that would eventually consume everything else. And that is what I mean when I say that history proved them right. They knew that this project would inevitably turn to what we see now. Now, in terms of historiography and in terms of the idea of there's this idea that, oh, the Bundists were stupid because they stayed in Poland, and the Zionists were smart because they went to Palestine. And if the stupid Bundists hadn't told Jews to stay in Poland, then the Jews would have all left for Palestine, right? This is kind of like a crude Zionist idea. I get people who DM me it all the time on social media, along with telling me that I ought to be gassed. And it's not true. There was no way for Palestine to take the 9 million Jews of Europe. There are not 9 million Jews in Palestine now. At the time of the Warsaw Ghetto, there were more Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto than there were in Palestine, in all of Palestine. The only protection that Palestine had from becoming another mass grave for the Jewish people like Europe was that the English turned back the Nazis. There was never any way for all of the Jews in Europe to go anywhere else. And so, with that in mind, on a collective level, not on an individual one, the Bund were not stupid to fight for their rights. They weren't stupid to arm up and defend themselves from anti-Semitic attacks where they were. They were people who were cognizant of the reality that there was no collective escape from Poland.
Hmm. Yeah, this flies in the face of what we usually hear, which is that, Palestine was there as an escape, as the rescue, that why didn't everyone just go there? Yeah, that's really important history. Um, in our last 5 minutes, I want to first just talk about Doikite Because it's kind of a buzzword right now among left Jews, I've seen hats and T-shirts with it. It was central governing idea of the Bund. One of them, Doigkeit, here-ness. We fight for liberation wherever we are. Uh, how do you define Doigkeit? It's one of those words it's one of those language words that's hard to translate exactly. And how does it apply to this moment?
I'll start by talking about what it meant historically. The Bund came up in one of the most anti-Semitic places in history. Jews were not simply like a group that there was bigotry against in the Tsarist Empire, nor in interwar Poland. They were a racialized minority with legal restrictions. In the Tsarist Empire, it was marked on your passport if you were a Jew, and in fact, your passports were marked as Jew until the fall of the Soviet Union. It was a place where there were strict quotas on Jewish education, where Jews were not allowed out of a geographically defined place called the Pale of Settlement, where they weren't allowed in certain professions to buy land, all of that. And where, obviously, as we all know, there was a lot of pogroms. That was the Tsarist Empire. In interwar Poland, the government was so obsessed with ethnically cleansing its 3 million Jewish citizens, they tried to convince France to let them colonize Madagascar and turn it into a prison camp for Jews. This is the psychosis of this place. It was a place that instituted segregation in its universities, literally segregated seating. They called it the ghetto benches. It was a place with constant violent attacks on Jewish communities where Jews were stripped of their licenses. They weren't allowed to, get government jobs. They were fired from nationalized industries. Towards the end, professional associations were Aryans only. These were incredibly racist places in a way that was not just about individual feeling, but was structural. And they were also places where, at that time, most of the Jews in the world lived. And so here-ness, Doigkeit, was this defiant assertion that we're not going anywhere. Fuck you. You might hate us. You might want to drive us out. You might try to make us miserable. We're not leaving. It reminds me most of the Palestinian concept of samud, steadfastness. And Doigkeit was defended with arms. It was defended with armed militias that physically protected neighborhoods and that physically fought back. And that was the context then. At this point in history, there are 7,000 Jews left in Poland, not 3,300,000 like there were before the war. Jewish communities of Eastern Europe have been completely decimated, though there, are Jewish communities still in Russia and Ukraine. And the largest Jewish communities in the world are in Israel and in America. So what does Doigkeit mean in that context, which is so, so different? To me, I took a larger meaning to it that's not just about Jews. I hate, and I've always hated the idea that everyone has their little fucking ethnic homeland that they belong and they have to go back to, and your blood defines where you should live. Like, I'm half Puerto Rican, right? I love Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico, Puerto Ricans continuously like fucking awe me with their ingenuity, their strength, their creativity. But I don't think I'm incomplete because I'm not living in Mocha, like where my grandfather is, right? I think that this world is all of ours, and that you have to like live and fight for things to be better where you are, as opposed to making up these fairy tales about fucking ethno-states where we all have to sort ourselves off into the land of our fathers and everything is going to be good when we're with our imaginary community, which is ultimately what Zionism is. Those sort of fantasies are always built on blood. They're always built on ethnic cleansing. And for me, what here-ness is it means that no, you stay where you are and you fight across difference, however flawed, however imperfect, however shit it is, and that the world belongs to all of us.
It's magnificent. I also like how you made I hadn't really thought of it in these terms, but the Palestinian project right now is a Doikite project, because of course
Exactly.
they're
Like
being chased out.
I have a friend, she's in Mustafa Riyata. She's doing she's a Jewish girl. She's doing protective presence. Every fucking day, these you can only call them pogromists. The settlers are only these dead-eyed pogromists are going to Palestinian homes and beating the shit out of old women with sticks and stealing their goats and smashing their beautiful stained glass windows and destroying their crops every fucking day in the
Hmm.
West Bank, not even in Gaza. They're making people's lives hell, and they're mutilating people, destroying their property, shooting them in the head with tear gas canisters, just in an attempt to drive people off of their lands. And Palestinians still indomitably and so admirably and with so much grace are like, fuck you. No, you cannot fucking get rid of us. We are here. This is our land.
Hmm. That's excellent. I want to just very quick. We have 5 minutes. I just want to very quickly talk about, because here I am in Canada. I feel privileged to be in Canada. Canada sucks in a lot of ways, but we are not, how do I put this? Our political system isn't quite as polarized and nuts as what goes on in the United States. At least that's how I see it. I could be completely wrong. But right now, the experience that you guys are having over the past 2 weeks, for example, is just an absolute. It looks like a turmoil, like a boiling cauldron of insanity and chaos. So I just want to quickly ask. Recently Joe Biden quit as the presidential race. Kamala Harris is going to be the new nominee for the Democrats. Does this make you hopeful? Do you think she can win? Do you care? Do you support her? Is she just a total disappointment? Where do you stand in? So what I want is a glimpse into a progressive perspective on current American politics.
Shit, man. I do think she can win. I think it was absolutely hopeless running Joe Biden. I mean, this man, first of all, he's responsible for the genocide just as much as Israel. Let's be clear about that. Like, this is a genocide that is, 100% enabled by him. And that was why I voted, why I turned in a blank ballot, in the primaries to show my complete disgust with that. But also, he's senile. His brain is leaking out of his fucking ears. He can't make a sentence. I wonder if part of the reason he supports Israel so much is he thinks that Bibi Netanyahu is Golda Meir. This man, he could not. And so everything that Trump was doing, including, getting a tradcath freak like Vance, this guyliner freak, everything that Trump was doing was tailored on the idea that he was just gonna win by a landslide because the guy that was running against him can't make a sentence. And I think the fact that Kamala Harris does not have her brain melting out of her ears, that she is a person who can speak, and also who has in some ways been shielded from responsibility for the genocide because she's been so marginalized in her vice president role and so disappeared. I don't mean like morally shielded, but I just mean in terms of the public perception. I think actually does give her a chance of winning, a really good chance. Do I think Kamala Harris is going to redeem the American project and introduce socialism and end the empire? No, of course not. Of course not. No American president will ever. But do I think it would be better to have a Kamala Harris presidency than Trump's? Obviously, yes, of course.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. I wish that I didn't have to leave it there. There's so much to talk about, and this has been illuminating and wonderful on so many levels. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And other than having a humongous book coming out, what are you spending your day doing? What are you doing these days now that you're done that huge project?
And besides that and playing chess, traumatizing you by bringing up my chess playing, there's a community garden across the street. I work there a lot.
Wonderful. Wonderful. All right. I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much, Molly.
Thank you so much.
Have a great rest of your day. Well, we've come to the end of our show. We'd like to thank you for listening, and we'd like to thank everyone who made our podcast possible, including United Jewish People's Order Executive Director Serena Sarin and our guest, Molly Crabapple. This podcast was recorded at Walt Whitman Studios in Toronto. The theme music was composed by Serena Sarin with help from me. My name is David Wall. Until next time, seid gesund.